If a stranger asked you one question that could change your entire life, would you answer honestly? The neon open sign buzzed softly against the rain as Claire Dawson wiped down the last empty booth of another 14-hour shift at a roadside diner outside Pittsburgh. Midnight had already slipped past, and the highway beyond the fogged windows looked almost abandoned except for the occasional pair of headlights cutting through the steady drizzle. The coffee machine hissed one last time before settling into silence. Every muscle in Claire's body ached, but she still smiled when the elderly truck driver at the counter thanked her for refilling his mug one final time. She had learned years ago that kindness cost less than resentment, even on nights when her rent was overdue and the tips in her apron barely covered groceries for the week. The bell above the entrance chimed. A man stepped inside without shaking a single drop of rain from his charcoal overcoat. He was unusually tall, impossibly composed, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to hurry anywhere in his life. His pale face seemed untouched by the cold outside, and the dim yellow lights reflected faintly in eyes the color of polished steel. Claire noticed the expensive shoes first, then the old-fashioned silver watch resting beneath his sleeve. Nothing about him belonged in a roadside diner after midnight. "Kitchen's closing," she said politely, offering the same practiced smile she gave every customer. "But I can still make coffee." The stranger glanced around the nearly empty room before taking the booth by the window instead of the clean table closer to the door. It was as if he had chosen the one place where he could watch both the rain outside and everyone inside at once. "Coffee is enough," he replied. His voice was calm, almost gentle, yet something about it made the quiet diner seem even quieter. Claire poured a fresh cup, setting it carefully in front of him. He thanked her with a small nod instead of looking down at the menu. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. The elderly truck driver struggled to stand, dropping a folded wallet onto the floor without noticing. Claire excused herself, picked it up, and hurried after him before he reached the parking lot. "Sir," she called through the rain, "you forgot this." The old man smiled with visible relief, thanking her twice before climbing into his truck. When Claire returned, the stranger had not touched his coffee. Instead, he watched the steam rise from the cup as though measuring time itself. "Most people would have kept it," he said quietly. Claire shrugged while collecting empty plates from another table. "Maybe, but it wasn't mine, even if no one would ever know." She paused only long enough to meet his eyes. "I'd know." Silence settled between them again. Somewhere in the kitchen, the dishwasher finished its final cycle with a dull metallic click. Claire reached for the coffee pot, offering him a refill. Although his cup remained nearly full, he accepted without taking his eyes off her. There was no judgment in his expression, only careful observation. "May I ask you one question?" he said. She laughed softly. "Sure, as long as it isn't about the pie we ran out an hour ago." For the first time, the corners of his mouth almost formed a smile. It disappeared before she could be certain she had seen it. "Imagine," he began, "that tomorrow morning you could wake up with every debt erased, every worry gone, every door opened. The only condition is that someone you've never met would quietly lose all of those opportunities instead. They would never know why. Would you accept?" Claire stopped moving. The diner suddenly felt smaller, the humming lights louder, the rain heavier against the windows. It sounded like a strange philosophical question from someone passing time on a lonely night. Yet something in his voice suggested the answer mattered far more than either of them should have admitted. She looked toward the dark highway where headlights disappeared into the rain one after another. Then she looked back at the stranger waiting without impatience, as though he had asked the same question many times before. "No," she answered simply. "Because if my happiness has to be borrowed from someone else's future, it was never really mine to begin with." The stranger never blinked. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the warm coffee cup. For the first time in centuries, something had happened that even he had not expected. And what Claire Dawson didn't know was that less than a mile away, 3 black luxury sedans had already turned off the highway, carrying people who would bow to the man sitting quietly across from her as if he ruled an invisible kingdom hidden beneath the ordinary American night. Claire Dawson stood motionless beside the booth long after the words had left her mouth. She had answered honestly because she had never learned how to do anything else. The stranger continued watching the untouched coffee, his expression unchanged, but the silence surrounding him felt different now, heavier, almost alive. Outside, the rain softened into a quiet mist that blurred the parking lot lights into glowing circles. The old truck driver disappeared onto the highway. completely unaware that his forgotten wallet had become part of something much larger than either of them could have imagined. Claire picked up the empty sugar dispenser from the table beside him and wiped away an invisible fingerprint simply to keep her hands busy. "That was an unusual question," she finally said with a nervous smile. "People usually ask where the nearest gas station is." The man slowly looked up. "And do they usually receive honest answers?" Claire laughed quietly. "Only if they ask honest questions." For a brief moment, something almost imperceptible softened in his pale eyes before disappearing behind the same calm expression he had carried since walking through the diner door. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a crisp $100 bill beneath the coffee cup. Claire noticed it immediately and gently pushed it back across the table. "Sir, your coffee was $4.20. The rest is for you." She shook her head. "That is too much. You earned it." "No," she answered politely. "I earned $4.20. Another silence settled between them. It was not uncomfortable. It simply felt unfamiliar, as though neither of them had expected the conversation to continue this long. The stranger studied her face carefully, searching for something she could not understand. Most people argued over money. Others accepted it before pretending to refuse. Claire did neither. She simply waited. Finally, she counted the exact amount for the coffee, placed the remaining bills back in front of him, and smiled. "You might need this more than I do someday." It was meant as a harmless joke, but the words lingered strangely in the air. At that exact moment, 3 black luxury sedans rolled quietly into the parking lot. Their headlights swept across the rain-covered windows before shutting off in perfect synchronization. Claire glanced outside. "Looks like somebody important is here." The stranger did not turn toward the window. It was almost as if he already knew who had arrived. The diner door opened again, letting in a rush of cool night air. 3 sharply dressed men entered together. Each wore a dark overcoat despite the warmer spring rain. They looked around the nearly empty diner with remarkable discipline before their eyes settled on the man sitting by the window. Claire expected them to greet him immediately, but instead they stopped several feet away, saying nothing. Their posture alone carried an unusual respect that she had only seen once before when soldiers welcomed a decorated veteran back to town during a 4th of July parade. The oldest of the 3 finally spoke. "Sir, we have been looking for you." His voice remained low enough that only the nearby tables could hear. The stranger answered without raising his eyes from the coffee. "You found me. The council has gathered. They can wait." The 3 men exchanged brief glances, but did not argue. Claire found the exchange oddly fascinating. She had waited on business executives before. She had served judges, senators, and even a retired movie star once. None of them inspired this level of quiet obedience. She approached carefully with the check. "Whenever you are ready." The stranger accepted the receipt, signed it without looking, and stood. He was even taller than she had realized. The room seemed to shrink slightly as he adjusted his coat. Before walking toward the door, he paused beside Claire. "Do not let the world convince you that honesty is expensive," he said softly. "It is the only thing that becomes more valuable every year you keep it." She blinked, surprised by the unexpected advice. "Thank you," she replied, "I guess." He gave the smallest nod and walked toward the exit. The 3 men immediately followed half a step behind him, naturally falling into formation without a single spoken instruction. Claire watched through the rain-covered glass as one of them quietly opened the rear passenger door before the stranger entered the waiting sedan. Every movement looked rehearsed, almost ceremonial. The convoy disappeared onto the dark highway within seconds, leaving only fading taillights reflected across the wet pavement. Claire looked down at the signed receipt still resting in her hand. There was no signature, only a single embossed crest pressed into the paper by unusually heavy ink, a crown surrounded by intricate vines she had never seen before. She frowned, turning the receipt beneath the fluorescent lights. What she did not know was that the same ancient symbol had not been used publicly for more than 300 years, and before sunrise, powerful people across a hidden world would learn that for the first time in centuries, the king had finally received the answer he had been waiting to hear. Claire Dawson slipped the unsigned receipt into her apron before finishing the last few minutes of her shift, telling herself it was nothing more than an unusual encounter with an unusually generous customer. By 1:30 in the morning, the diner lights had dimmed, the chairs rested upside down on freshly cleaned tables, and the familiar scent of coffee slowly faded beneath the sharp smell of lemon cleaner. She clocked out, pulled on her light jacket, and stepped into the cool Pennsylvania night. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement glossy beneath the streetlights. Her aging sedan waited alone near the edge of the parking lot, surrounded by silence that felt strangely deeper than usual. As she unlocked the driver's door, something caught her attention across the highway. The three black luxury sedans she had watched disappear only 20 minutes earlier now stood parked on the opposite shoulder with their headlights switched off. None of the passengers stepped outside. None of the engines appeared to be running. Yet the vehicles remained perfectly still, almost as if they had been waiting. Claire hesitated for only a second before shaking her head. Rich people were allowed to behave strangely if they wanted. She climbed into her car and started the engine. The old radio crackled with static before settling on a late-night jazz station. During the 30-minute drive home, she tried to push the mysterious customer out of her mind, but fragments of the conversation kept returning. Imagine tomorrow morning every debt erased. Would you accept? The question echoed through her thoughts with surprising weight. It was not the kind of conversation someone simply forgot. Meanwhile, less than a mile behind her, the convoy rolled silently onto the highway without turning on its headlights until Claire's taillights disappeared around the next curve. Inside the lead vehicle, no one spoke. The man sitting beside the window remained perfectly still, looking at the faint reflection of city lights sliding across the glass. One of his companions finally broke the silence. "Your Majesty, the council will not understand this delay." The pale man answered without looking away from the window. Understanding was never their strength. The conversation ended there. No one dared continue. Claire arrived at her apartment building shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning. It was an aging brick complex with narrow balconies and flickering hallway lights, but it was home. She climbed the stairs carrying a paper grocery bag filled with leftovers the cook insisted she take after every late shift. Mrs. Hernandez from apartment 12 opened her door just as Claire reached the second floor. The elderly widow smiled warmly. Working returned the smile. Every Tuesday, Mrs. Hernandez glanced at the grocery bag. "You brought too much food again." Claire laughed and handed her one of the wrapped sandwiches without hesitation. "Then you can help me solve that problem." The older woman thanked her before disappearing inside. Claire unlocked her own apartment, switched on the small lamp beside the couch, and finally removed the folded receipt from her apron. The strange embossed symbol still reflected softly beneath the light. Curious, she opened her laptop and searched for every description she could think of. Ancient crown, silver crest, circular vines, royal seal, decorative emblem. Hundreds of images appeared across the screen, but none matched the symbol pressed into the paper. After nearly 40 minutes, she closed the computer with a tired sigh. "It is probably some private company logo," she whispered to herself. Unfortunately for Claire, someone else had begun searching for her at almost the exact same moment. In a marble chamber hidden beneath one of the oldest estates in Pennsylvania, dozens of elegantly dressed figures stood around a circular table carved with symbols older than the United States itself. None of them questioned whether the answer had truly been spoken. They questioned only the consequences. An older woman with silver hair slowly looked toward the empty chair at the head of the table. "If she answered truthfully," she said, "the ancient oath has awakened." A younger council member frowned. "She is only a human waitress." The older woman closed her eyes. "That is exactly why this changes everything." Back inside her modest apartment, Claire placed the mysterious receipt inside the pages of an old cookbook simply because it seemed like a safe place to keep it. She turned off the lamp, climbed into bed, and closed her eyes, believing tomorrow would begin exactly like every other day before it. She had no way of knowing that before the next sunset, a formal invitation bearing the same forgotten crest would arrive at the diner, addressed not to Miss Claire Dawson, but to the woman whose single honest answer had quietly shaken an invisible kingdom that had remained unchanged for centuries. The following afternoon arrived with bright skies and the ordinary rhythm of small-town life. Yet Claire Dawson could not shake the feeling that something invisible had shifted overnight. The mysterious question lingered in the back of her mind while she tied on her apron and prepared the diner for another lunch rush. The morning crowd came and went with familiar conversations about construction projects, college football, rising grocery prices and weekend fishing plans. Everything looked exactly the same, but every so often Claire caught herself glancing toward the entrance without knowing why. Shortly after 2 o'clock, the front door opened, and every conversation inside the diner seemed to soften for reasons no one could explain. A sharply dressed man stepped inside carrying a long black envelope sealed with dark silver wax. He was not the stranger from the previous night. He appeared younger, with neatly combed dark hair and the composed posture of someone accustomed to delivering important messages. Instead of sitting down, he approached the front counter. "Miss Claire Dawson?" he asked politely. Claire looked up from the register with mild surprise. "That is me." The man offered a respectful nod before placing the envelope carefully on the polished countertop with both hands. "This has been delivered exactly as instructed." Claire frowned. "Who sent it?" The sender believed the contents would answer that question better than I could. Before she could ask another, he turned and quietly walked back outside. Through the front window, she watched him enter a black sedan that immediately pulled away without attracting unnecessary attention. Her manager, Frank Miller, wandered over carrying a stack of clean menus. "You know somebody rich?" he joked. Claire smiled awkwardly, apparently not well enough. Once the lunch crowd thinned, she carefully broke the silver seal. Inside rested a thick ivory card, embossed with the same unfamiliar crest she had discovered on the unsigned receipt the night before. Beneath the symbol appeared only a few neatly printed words. "Miss Claire Dawson, your presence is respectfully requested this evening at 7 o'clock. Transportation will be provided. Formal attire is not required. Your attendance remains entirely your choice." No company name, no address, no explanation. Only a handwritten note beneath the invitation caught her attention. "Thank you for answering honestly." Claire read the final sentence twice before quietly folding the invitation shut. "This has to be some kind of practical joke," she whispered. Frank glanced toward her from across the dining room. "Everything all right?" She slipped the invitation back inside its envelope. "Probably." But even as she answered, she was no longer convinced. During the next several hours, the invitation seemed almost heavier each time she looked at it resting beside the cash register. Customers came and went, yet she found herself wondering who would spend this much effort arranging a meeting with an ordinary waitress. By the time her evening shift ended, the parking lot had begun shadows cast by the setting sun. As Claire stepped outside, she immediately noticed a sleek black luxury sedan waiting beside the curb. It was spotless despite the dusty spring roads. A middle-aged driver wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit stepped out and opened the rear passenger door before she had taken 3 steps. "Good evening, Miss Dawson," he said with quiet professionalism. "Whenever you are ready." Claire looked around the parking lot expecting hidden cameras or laughing friends to appear, but everything remained perfectly still. "I do not even know where we are going," she admitted. The driver smiled politely. "You were told your attendance was entirely your choice. If you decline, I will wish you a pleasant evening and leave immediately." His calm response surprised her more than any pressure would have. There was no urgency, no persuasion, only patience. Claire looked down at the envelope in her hands before glancing back toward the familiar diner where she had spent countless ordinary days. Curiosity slowly outweighed hesitation. "Will I be back tonight?" she asked. "Before midnight," the driver answered. She took a slow breath, climbed into the quiet luxury sedan and watched through the window as her small workplace disappeared behind them. The ride began with peaceful country roads glowing beneath the golden light of sunset. But after nearly 40 minutes, the familiar highways gave way to winding forest roads she had never traveled before. Towering oak trees blocked much of the fading light, while elegant stone walls appeared between the branches, stretching farther than Claire could see. Then, just beyond the final curve, enormous wrought iron gates slowly opened without anyone stepping forward to greet them. What Claire could not possibly know was that no ordinary guest had crossed those gates in more than 3 centuries, and every pair of unseen eyes waiting beyond them had already begun wondering why the king himself had chosen to invite a human waitress inside. The black sedan rolled silently through the open gates, and Claire Dawson found herself staring through the window as though the world outside had quietly slipped into another century. The stone walls that lined the winding road were covered with thick ivy, while towering oak trees formed a canopy overhead, allowing only narrow ribbons of evening sunlight to reach the ground. After nearly half a mile, the trees opened to reveal an enormous estate unlike anything she had ever seen. It was neither a castle nor a modern mansion. Instead, it blended old European architecture with understated American luxury, standing proudly above a series of perfectly maintained gardens and reflecting pools that shimmered beneath the fading sky. The building carried an unusual stillness, as if every brick remembered stories no history book had ever recorded. The driver stopped beneath a wide stone entrance where several attendants waited in dark formal clothing. None of them rushed forward. None of them spoke unnecessarily. Every movement was measured, graceful, and remarkably quiet. As Claire stepped from the vehicle, one attendant offered a polite smile. "Welcome, Miss Dawson." She looked around, unable to hide her curiosity. "This place is beautiful." The attendant inclined his head. "Our host hoped you would find it comfortable." Before she could ask another question, the enormous wooden doors opened without visible effort. Warm golden light spilled across the marble entrance hall, revealing polished floors, towering columns, and crystal chandeliers that cast soft reflections across every surface. Classical music drifted gently through the air, played by musicians she could not immediately see. Claire instinctively slowed her pace. Every detail felt expensive, but nothing seemed designed to impress. Instead, the estate carried the quiet confidence of a place that had never needed anyone's approval. As she followed the attendant through the grand hallway, she noticed portraits stretching along both walls. Men and women dressed in clothing from different centuries gazed back with calm expressions that somehow looked strangely familiar. The faces changed with every painting, yet each pair of eyes carried the same unusual intensity she had noticed in the mysterious stranger at the diner. She paused before one particularly large portrait depicting a dignified gentleman standing beneath winter trees. "These paintings are incredible," she said softly. The attendant answered without stopping. "They represent generations of distinguished leadership." Claire nodded, though the explanation somehow felt incomplete. They entered an elegant reception room where a long dining table had been prepared with simple white china, fresh flowers and candlelight rather than extravagant decorations. There were no crowds, no elaborate celebration. Only one place had been set for dinner opposite the chair at the far end. Claire glanced around the nearly empty room. "Am I early?" she asked. "No, Miss Dawson." "Then where is everyone?" The attendant smiled politely. "Exactly where they have been instructed to remain." Before Claire could consider what that meant, another figure entered carrying a silver tray with sparkling water. The young woman serving the refreshments appeared nervous despite her professional composure. As she placed the glass before Claire, her hand trembled just enough for a folded linen napkin to slip onto the polished floor. Claire immediately bent to retrieve it before the young attendant could react. "Here you go," she said warmly. "Thank you." The woman whispered with visible relief. Their brief exchange lasted only seconds, but something unexpected happened. Several attendants standing across the room quietly looked toward one another with expressions Claire could not understand. It was not surprise exactly. It was recognition, as though they had just witnessed something they had secretly hoped would happen. Claire noticed the strange silence. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. "Not at all," the senior attendant replied gently. Quite the opposite, he offered no further explanation. Moments later, the heavy doors opened once again. Claire instinctively stood as the familiar stranger from the diner entered the room wearing a perfectly tailored black suit instead of the charcoal overcoat she remembered. He looked exactly the same, composed and calm, yet somehow even more commanding within the quiet elegance of the estate. He stopped several feet away and inclined his head politely. "Good evening, Miss Dawson." She smiled with genuine relief. "So you really are the one behind all of this?" "Yes." He gestured toward the empty chair opposite his own. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." Claire looked around the enormous room before returning her attention to him. "I have to admit something. Please. I still have absolutely no idea why I am here." For the first time since she had met him, a faint smile lingered on his face a fraction longer than before. "That," he replied calmly, "is exactly why tonight matters." What Claire could not see beyond the closed doors was that dozens of silent observers throughout the estate had already learned she had arrived safely, and every one of them now waited for a dinner conversation that many believed could alter traditions that had remained untouched for hundreds of years. Claire Dawson lowered herself into the chair with the same quiet composure she had carried through every difficult shift at the diner, although nothing about the evening felt ordinary anymore. Soft candlelight reflected across polished crystal while the distant sound of a string quartet drifted through the enormous estate, creating an atmosphere that was elegant without feeling extravagant. The mysterious man remained standing for another moment before taking his seat across from her. An attendant poured sparkling water into their glasses before silently disappearing with the rest of the staff. Within seconds, the dining room became almost completely empty again. Claire glanced around the vast space. "Does everyone here always move that quietly?" she asked with an amused smile. "Only when something important is happening," the man answered. "And is something important happening?" He looked at her for a brief moment before lifting his glass. That depends on the choices made tonight. Dinner arrived course by course, each dish prepared with remarkable simplicity rather than unnecessary luxury. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, roasted vegetables, seasonal fruit, and homemade soup reminded Claire more of thoughtful hospitality than fine dining. She noticed something else almost immediately. Every attendant waited until she had been served before placing anything in front of the man across from her. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore once she recognized the pattern. "You have everyone here trained incredibly well," she observed. "Respect becomes habit after enough years," he replied calmly, assuming he meant decades of experience running an estate or perhaps a family business. The conversation drifted naturally from small-town life to favorite books, childhood memories and places they had each traveled. To her surprise, the stranger listened far more than he spoke. Whenever Claire mentioned helping Mrs. Hernandez, working double shifts, or returning the truck driver's wallet, he never interrupted. He simply watched with quiet attention, almost as though every ordinary detail mattered more than grand accomplishments. Eventually she set down her fork. "Can I ask you something this time?" "Of course. You asked me one impossible question at the diner. Tonight you invited me to a place that looks like it belongs in a movie. Everyone treats you like you are." Well, she searched for the right words. "Like you are the most important person in the room." A faint smile crossed his face. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Claire considered the question honestly. "I think you are wealthy. I think people respect you. But I also think none of that explains why you wanted to meet a waitress who serves coffee on the night shift." Before he could answer, the large wooden doors opened quietly. 5 elegantly dressed men and women entered together. Their clothing reflected modern American fashion, yet each carried the same calm dignity Claire had noticed throughout the estate. They stopped several feet from the table. None of them sat, none of them spoke. Their eyes moved from the stranger to Claire, with expressions that ranged from curiosity to visible concern. The oldest gentleman finally addressed the man at the table. "Sir, the council has assembled." Claire noticed something unexpected. Although the words sounded respectful, they also carried unmistakable urgency. The man did not immediately respond. Instead, he calmly folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. "They may continue waiting." A younger woman stepped forward despite the hesitation visible on her face. "With respect, this cannot be postponed any longer." For the first time since arriving, the warmth in the room seemed to cool. The stranger slowly turned toward the group. He never raised his voice. It already has. Silence followed. The 5 visitors lowered their eyes almost simultaneously before quietly stepping backward. Not one of them attempted another argument. Claire watched the exchange with growing confusion. She had never seen authority exercised so effortlessly. No threats, no anger, no negotiation, simply quiet certainty. Once the doors closed again, she looked back across the table. "I feel like I accidentally walked into the middle of something much bigger than I understand." He nodded once. "You did." Claire laughed nervously. "Should I be worried?" He studied her expression for several long seconds before answering with complete sincerity. "No, you should only continue being exactly who you have always been." Those words should have reassured her, yet they somehow made the mystery even deeper. Outside the dining room, unseen beyond the carved wooden doors, dozens of silent observers waited as ancient traditions strained against an unexpected future. And what Claire could not possibly know was that before the night ended, she would be asked to stand before people whose opinions had shaped an invisible world for centuries, long before anyone intended to reveal the true identity of the man sitting quietly across the table. Claire Dawson followed the senior attendant through a series of long marble corridors illuminated by warm candlelight instead of electric fixtures. The deeper they walked into the estate, the quieter everything became. The distant music faded until only the soft echo of footsteps remained. Large windows overlooked moonlit gardens where silver fountains reflected the evening sky, while ancient oak doors lined both sides of the hallway like silent guardians protecting forgotten history. Claire noticed that every person they passed paused respectfully before the man walking beside her. Some lowered their heads. Others simply stepped aside without speaking. None of them looked surprised to see him. They looked surprised to see her. Finally, the corridor opened into an enormous circular chamber unlike anything Claire had ever imagined. Dark polished stone stretched beneath her feet, while 12 tall columns disappeared into a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. At the center of the room stood a single elevated chair carved from black marble. It was elegant without appearing extravagant. its design remarkably simple except for the same ancient crest Claire had already seen on the receipt and invitation. Around the chamber stood dozens of elegantly dressed men and women arranged in perfect silence. Their expressions revealed curiosity, concern, and quiet disbelief, but no one spoke until the stranger stepped forward. The room immediately grew still. Claire instinctively realized she had entered a place where every word carried unusual weight. The older silver-haired woman she had never met inclined her head respectfully before addressing the man. "Your Majesty, the council is assembled." Claire felt the words before she fully understood them. "Your Majesty." Her eyes slowly shifted toward the man she had served coffee only the night before. He turned to face the gathering with calm confidence before speaking in the same steady voice she remembered from the diner. "Thank you for waiting." No one questioned him. No one moved. Claire looked from one face to another, searching for signs of a joke or elaborate performance, but every expression remained completely sincere. She looked back at him, her heartbeat quickening. "Your Majesty?" she repeated almost under her breath. He turned toward her with the same calm expression he had carried since they first met. "There is something I should have told you sooner." Claire stared at him in stunned silence. "You are a king?" "Yes." The answer arrived without hesitation or pride, simply as fact. "But that is impossible. Many things appear impossible until they become personal." She took a slow breath, trying to organize everything she had experienced since the mysterious question inside the diner. The expensive convoy, the enormous estate, the unexplained invitation. Suddenly every piece fit together, even if the picture itself seemed unbelievable. "King of where?" she asked quietly. A faint smile crossed his face. "That answer requires a longer conversation than tonight has allowed." Before Claire could ask another question, the silver-haired council member stepped forward once more. "Your Majesty, tradition requires confirmation before we proceed." He nodded once. "Proceed." The woman turned toward Claire with remarkable kindness. "Miss Dawson, yesterday evening this man asked you a single question inside your diner. Did anyone instruct you how to answer?" Claire frowned. "No." "Did anyone offer you money or promises in exchange for your answer?" "Of course not." "Did you believe your answer would bring you here?" Claire almost laughed. "I thought I would finish my shift and go home." A quiet murmur spread through the chamber. It was not outrage. It sounded more like astonishment. The council members exchanged thoughtful glances, while several lowered their eyes toward the polished floor. The silver-haired woman looked back toward the throne. The answer was freely given. The man everyone called Your Majesty slowly rose from the marble chair. "As I expected." Claire watched him with growing confusion. "Can somebody please explain what is happening?" He walked toward her, stopping only a few feet away. The candlelight reflected softly across his pale features as his steady eyes met hers. "The question I asked you was never casual conversation." He paused briefly before continuing. "For more than 300 years, every generation has protected an ancient tradition. I have asked that same question to scholars, judges, leaders, millionaires, and people born into extraordinary privilege." Claire listened without interrupting. "Every one of them chose themselves." The chamber fell completely silent. "You were the first person who did not." Claire struggled to find words. "That cannot be true." "Unfortunately," he answered quietly, "it is." What Claire still did not know was why one honest answer mattered so deeply that it had brought an ancient kingdom to the edge of changing forever, and before anyone inside that chamber could explain the full truth, the oldest law they had protected for centuries would demand that every one of them make a choice of their own. Claire Dawson remained standing in the center of the circular chamber, surrounded by faces that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. No one raised a voice, no one questioned the king's words. Instead, an almost reverent silence settled across the room, as though everyone present understood the importance of a moment she could barely comprehend. She looked from the marble throne to the silver-haired councilwoman and back again, searching for an explanation that fit the ordinary world she had known only hours before. "I am sorry," Claire said quietly. "I still do not understand why one answer matters this much." The king studied with the same calm attention that had unsettled him inside the diner. "Because the question was never about generosity," he replied. "It was about freedom." Claire frowned. "Freedom?" The silver-haired woman stepped forward with gentle dignity. "For generations, every ruler of our people has carried the responsibility of asking the same question, not to test intelligence, not to measure kindness, only to discover whether someone exists who cannot be tempted into exchanging another person's future for their own comfort." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, trying to process the words. People really chose themselves every time? The older woman nodded sadly. Some hesitated, some apologized afterward, some convinced themselves the sacrifice was justified, but every answer carried the same destination. The king spoke again. You were different because you never negotiated with your conscience. Claire almost laughed in disbelief. I answered without thinking. Exactly, he said. Your character spoke before your fear had the chance. A quiet murmur traveled through the council once more. Claire noticed that several members seemed relieved, while others appeared deeply troubled. One distinguished gentleman finally stepped forward, bowing respectfully before addressing the king. Your Majesty, tradition also requires that she understands what her answer has awakened. The king gave a single nod. She deserves the truth. He motioned for Claire to follow him through an arched doorway leading into an immense circular library, unlike anything she had ever imagined. Shelves climbed 3 stories high, filled with leather-bound volumes whose worn spines suggested centuries of careful preservation. A massive skylight revealed a field of stars above, while hundreds of small lamps cast warm golden light across polished wooden tables. There were no computers, no television screens, only books, maps, and quiet history waiting patiently to be remembered. Claire slowly turned in place. This is incredible. Knowledge survives longer than kingdoms, the king answered. He stopped beside an ancient wooden display case where a weathered parchment rested beneath protective glass. Although the faded handwriting was impossible to read from where she stood, one symbol remained perfectly recognizable. It was the same crowned crest embossed on the receipt, the invitation, and the marble throne. More than 300 years ago, he said calmly, my ancestors created an oath that every ruler would honor. Power could never belong to someone who believed personal gain was more valuable than another person's future, so each generation searched, hoping to find proof that such people still existed. Claire looked at the fragile document before meeting his eyes again. You mean the question was never meant to choose a queen or a successor? No. His answer came immediately. It was meant to protect an idea. She felt an unexpected sense of relief. Somehow that answer sounded more beautiful than the assumptions racing through her mind. Then why invite me here, she asked. Because after centuries of failure, your answer proved the oath still has meaning. He paused before continuing more quietly. And because the traditions built around that oath have become complicated. Claire noticed the brief hesitation, sensing there was still far more he had chosen not to reveal. Before she could ask another question, the silver-haired councilwoman entered the library carrying a small wooden box. She approached the king with visible respect before placing it carefully upon the table. Your Majesty, she said softly, the council has reached its first decision. The king looked down at the unopened box without touching it. Claire noticed something unusual for the first time since meeting him. The calm certainty in his expression gave way to the faintest shadow of concern. She had no idea what rested inside the polished wood, but every person in the room seemed to understand its significance. And what Claire could not possibly know was that the object inside that simple box represented the first real challenge to traditions that had governed an unseen kingdom for centuries, forcing the king to choose between unquestioned authority and the quiet truth spoken by an ordinary waitress over a cup of coffee. Claire Dawson looked at the small wooden box, resting quietly on the polished library table. It was not decorated with gold or precious stones. Instead, it appeared remarkably plain, crafted from dark walnut worn smooth by generations of careful hands. Somehow that simplicity made it feel even more important. The king remained silent for several long moments before finally placing his hand upon the lid. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked toward the councilwoman who had carried it into the library. Has everyone agreed? She answered carefully. They have agreed that tradition must be honored. They have not agreed on what tradition now requires. Claire shifted her attention between them. I feel like everyone knows the ending except me. The king glanced toward her with an expression that carried something unfamiliar, not authority, not distance, something closer to quiet regret. Then that should change. He slowly opened the wooden box. Inside rested a single silver key no longer than 4 inches, resting upon dark blue velvet. Unlike ordinary keys, its handle formed the same ancient crest Claire had already seen throughout the estate. Time had not tarnished its polished surface. It almost seemed untouched by age itself. Claire leaned forward slightly. It is beautiful. It has remained unused for 312 years, the king replied. Why? She asked. He gently lifted the key from the velvet lining. Because it was never meant to open a door. Claire frowned. Then what does it unlock? He turned the key slowly between his fingers as candlelight reflected across the engraved silver. The answer only deepened her confusion. The silver-haired councilwoman stepped beside an enormous stained glass window overlooking the moonlit gardens. "Long ago," she began, "our ancestors believed that power survives only when it serves others instead of itself. Every generation repeated the same question, hoping one day someone would answer as you did." Claire nodded slowly. "And if someone finally answered?" The older woman looked toward the king before continuing. "Then the ruler would receive the right to choose whether the ancient oath should continue exactly as it had, or whether it should change forever." Claire stared quietly at the silver key. "So this was never really about finding me?" "No," the king answered honestly. "It was about discovering whether hope itself still existed." His words lingered in the library longer than either of them expected. Claire walked slowly toward one of the towering bookshelves, running her fingertips lightly across leather-bound volumes that had witnessed centuries pass in silence. "You have spent hundreds of years asking the same question because you stopped believing anyone would answer differently." He did not deny it. Eventually, tradition becomes routine. Routine becomes expectation. Expectation becomes certainty. Claire turned back toward him. "Until someone surprises you." For the first time since revealing his identity, the king's reserved smile reached his eyes. "Yes." The quiet moment lasted only seconds before another council member entered the library, carrying several carefully folded documents. His expression remained respectful, but concern shadowed every movement. "Your Majesty, preparations are complete." The king accepted the papers without reading them. After the council member quietly departed, Claire noticed the hesitation that followed. "Those papers have something to do with me, do not they?" He nodded once, indirectly. "Is this where you tell me there is another impossible decision waiting?" "No." He folded the documents closed. "This one belongs to me." Claire studied his face carefully. Since meeting him inside the diner, she had always seen certainty. Tonight, for the first time, she saw responsibility. It was heavier than confidence and quieter than fear. She realized the question he had asked her had never placed the greatest burden upon her shoulders. It had always rested upon his own. Outside the library windows, a cool breeze stirred the ancient oak trees surrounding the estate. Somewhere in the distance, the bell of an old clock tower marked the passing hour. The king walked toward the window, the silver key still resting in his hand. "Power becomes dangerous," he said softly, almost as if speaking more to history than to Claire, "when it survives longer than compassion." Claire looked at him with growing understanding. "And you think compassion has been missing?" He remained silent for a moment before answering. "For far too long." What Claire still did not know was that before sunrise the king would be required to stand before the entire council and publicly declare whether centuries of unquestioned tradition deserved to continue unchanged, or whether one ordinary waitress had proven that even the oldest kingdoms sometimes needed the courage to trust humanity once again. Claire Dawson stood beside the towering library window long after the final words had faded into silence. Outside, the moon hung above the sprawling estate, bathing the ancient gardens in silver light while fountains whispered softly across the quiet grounds. Everything about the place seemed timeless, yet she could not escape the feeling that history itself was waiting for the decision resting in the king's hands. Sebastian Vitelli carefully returned the silver key to its wooden box before closing the lid with deliberate care. The simple gesture carried the weight of a promise rather than the conclusion of a ceremony. Claire watched him for a moment before speaking. "If the choice belongs to you, why bring me here at all?" He looked toward her with the same calm expression she had first seen across a diner booth, but there was less distance in his eyes now. "Because decisions made without seeing the people they affect become nothing more than habits." Claire considered his answer. "So I was supposed to remind you what ordinary life looks like. You did much more than that." Before she could ask what he meant, the heavy library doors opened once again. The silver-haired councilwoman entered quietly and inclined her head. "Your Majesty, the council has gathered in the Hall of Oaths." Sebastian nodded. "We will join them." Claire instinctively took a small step backward. "I do not think I belong in a meeting like that." "Tonight," the councilwoman replied gently, "your presence is part of the tradition." Together they walked through another series of elegant corridors until the estate opened into a magnificent hall unlike any room Claire had seen before. Hundreds of candles illuminated polished stone walls engraved with names stretching back farther than American history itself. At the far end stood the same black marble chair, now facing several semicircles of council members, seated with remarkable discipline. No voices echoed through the chamber. Every eye followed the king as he entered, then quietly shifted toward Claire. She felt suddenly aware of her simple blouse, her sensible shoes, and the fact that less than 24 hours earlier she had been pouring coffee for truck drivers and college students. Yet no one mocked her, no one dismissed her, they simply watched. Sebastian remained standing before the marble chair, instead of sitting upon it. For more than 3 centuries, he began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast chamber. Our people have honored the ancient oath exactly as it was written. The room remained perfectly silent. The purpose of that oath was never to preserve authority. It was to preserve integrity. Several council members lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Sebastian continued. Yesterday evening, the question was answered as our ancestors once believed it could be. He glanced briefly toward Claire before looking back to the assembly. Not through calculation, not through ambition, through instinct. A distinguished gentleman slowly rose from his seat. Your Majesty, no one disputes her answer. Our concern is whether one extraordinary moment should outweigh 3 centuries of established custom. Another council member stood beside him. Traditions survive because they protect us from impulsive change. Claire listened carefully, surprised by the respectful tone of the disagreement. No one argued with anger, they argued with history. Sebastian folded his hands behind his back. Tradition has value only while it continues serving its original purpose. He paused long enough for every word to settle. When tradition begins protecting itself instead of the people it was created to serve, it quietly forgets why it exists. A thoughtful silence spread throughout the chamber. Claire realized this conversation was no longer about her answer. It had become something much larger. It was about whether centuries of certainty could accept even the smallest possibility that they had stopped listening to the values they claimed to defend. The silver-haired councilwoman slowly stood. Your Majesty, if you invoke the authority granted by the ancient oath, there will be no return to the previous order. Sebastian answered without hesitation. I understand. Claire looked toward him with quiet concern. She had only known him for one extraordinary day, yet she could already see the cost carried behind his composure. This was not a choice between victory and defeat. It was a choice between comfort and conviction. As the oldest clock inside the estate quietly struck midnight, Sebastian placed his hand upon the polished wooden box containing the silver key. The hall grew so still that even the sound of flickering candles seemed unusually clear. What Claire could not yet know was that the next word spoken inside that chamber would become the most important decision of the king's long reign, and by sunrise the invisible world hidden beyond ordinary American life would never again be governed the way it had been for the last 300 years. The silence inside the Hall of Oaths stretched across the chamber like the calm before sunrise. Every council member remained standing, waiting not for permission to speak, but for the king to decide whether centuries of certainty would continue unchanged. Claire Dawson stood quietly near the edge of the gathering, still struggling to believe that less than 24 hours earlier she had been refilling coffee cups beneath the humming lights of a roadside diner. Now she found herself witnessing a decision that would shape an invisible society she had never imagined existed. Sebastian Vitelli slowly opened the wooden box once again and lifted the silver key into the candlelight. Its polished surface reflected hundreds of tiny flames until the ancient crest seemed almost alive. He held it for several moments before addressing the chamber. When my predecessors accepted this responsibility, they believed no law should survive unless it continued serving truth. His steady voice echoed through the vast hall. For generations we convinced ourselves that repeating the question was enough to honor the oath. We forgot that the oath was never about the question. It was about our willingness to accept an unexpected answer. A thoughtful murmur moved gently through the council before fading once again into respectful silence. The distinguished gentleman who had spoken earlier rose to his feet. Your Majesty, history teaches caution. Change has consequences beyond what any generation can foresee. Sebastian inclined his head respectfully. History also teaches that fear often disguises itself as wisdom. No one interrupted him. For 300 years we waited for proof that integrity still existed beyond our walls. Yesterday evening that proof walked into a small diner wearing an apron instead of a crown. Claire immediately lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the unexpected attention. She had never considered herself extraordinary. She still did not. Sebastian turned toward her for only a brief moment. She did not answer because she wished to impress anyone. She answered because she did not know another way to live. The silver-haired councilwoman slowly stepped forward, carrying an aged leather book bound with faded blue ribbon. She carefully opened it before the assembly, revealing pages filled with elegant handwriting stretching back through countless generations. "The Chronicle of the Oath has recorded every question and every answer since its beginning," she said softly. "Tonight, for the first time in more than 3 centuries, a new outcome must be written." She offered the open book to Sebastian together with an old fountain pen resting across the pages. The king accepted both with quiet reverence before writing several deliberate lines. When he finished, he closed the journal gently instead of dramatically, as though respecting the weight of every name that had come before his own. He then placed the silver key back inside the wooden box and closed the lid. "From this night forward," he announced, "the question shall remain, but its purpose shall change." Curious expressions spread throughout the chamber. No longer will it search for failure, it will search for hope. No longer will we ask because we expect disappointment. We will ask because we believe goodness still deserves to be found. Claire watched the faces around the room soften almost imperceptibly. Some council members nodded quietly, others reflected in thoughtful silence. Even those who had disagreed earlier appeared less resistant than before. The older gentleman slowly bowed his head. "Perhaps tradition has not ended tonight," he admitted. "Perhaps it has remembered itself." A faint smile crossed the silver-haired councilwoman's face. "That is the most faithful form of change." Claire finally found the courage to speak. "I never meant to change anything." Sebastian looked toward her with genuine warmth. "That is precisely why you did." The words settled over the chamber with remarkable peace. There had been no battle, no dramatic victory. Only a truth quietly accepted because no one could honestly deny it any longer. Beyond the tall windows, the darkness of night had already begun yielding to the faintest hint of blue along the eastern horizon. The first signs of dawn touched the estate with gentle light, and for the first time since arriving, Claire noticed the faces around her seemed lighter than before, as though an invisible burden carried across generations had finally begun to lift. What she still did not know was that before she returned to her ordinary life, Sebastian would offer her one final choice that had nothing to do with ancient traditions or forgotten oaths, but everything to do with the future both of them would freely choose after the longest night either of them would ever remember. The first light of dawn slowly spilled across the eastern sky, replacing candlelight with a soft golden glow that filtered through the tall windows of the Hall of Oaths. For the first time since Claire Dawson had entered the ancient estate, the enormous chamber no longer felt intimidating. The silence that remained was no longer filled with uncertainty, it carried relief. Council members who had stood divided only an hour earlier now spoke quietly among themselves, not with suspicion, but with thoughtful curiosity about the future they had just chosen together. Sebastian Vitelli remained near the marble chair until the last formal record had been sealed inside the Chronicle of the Oath. One by one, the members of the council approached him with respectful bows before leaving the chamber without ceremony. There were no celebrations, no grand speeches, only the quiet dignity of people accepting that history had turned a page without force. Claire watched them disappear through the enormous wooden doors until only she, Sebastian, and the silver-haired councilwoman remained. The older woman smiled warmly at Claire before offering a graceful nod. "Miss Dawson, thank you for reminding us that traditions exist to protect goodness, not replace it." Claire shook her head modestly. "I only answered a question." "Sometimes," the older woman replied. "That is how history begins." She quietly excused herself, leaving the vast chamber unusually peaceful. Claire looked around the now nearly empty hall before turning towards Sebastian. "So, what happens now?" He allowed himself a small smile. "Now I take you home." She blinked in surprise. "That is it?" "That was always the agreement." Claire laughed softly. "After everything that happened tonight, I expected at least another mysterious speech. You have already heard enough of those." Together they walked slowly through the estate as morning sunlight illuminated details Claire had been unable to notice the night before. The gardens stretched across rolling hills covered with early spring flowers. Songbirds filled the cool morning air, and the reflecting pools shimmered beneath the growing light. Everything looked less mysterious beneath the sunrise, and more like a place where people had quietly built a life over countless generations. As they crossed one of the stone bridges overlooking a peaceful pond, Claire finally stopped walking. "Can I ask you one last question?" Sebastian turned toward her. "You have earned that privilege." She looked out across the still water before speaking. After searching for hundreds of years, were you disappointed that the answer came someone completely ordinary? He considered the question carefully before answering. No. His voice remained calm, but warmer than before. I believe I spent centuries looking in extraordinary places because I forgot where goodness usually lives. Claire smiled without looking at him. In roadside diners, sometimes, he glanced toward the sunrise reflecting across the pond. Sometimes in neighbors who share food they cannot afford to give away. Sometimes in people who return wallets without expecting rewards. Sometimes in waitresses who believe another person's future matters as much as their own. Claire looked down with quiet embarrassment. That still feels like something anyone should do, Sebastian nodded. Perhaps, yet not everyone does. They resumed walking toward the front entrance where the same black sedan waited quietly beneath the stone archway. The driver stepped forward and opened the rear door with the same quiet professionalism as before. Before Claire entered the vehicle, Sebastian reached into his coat pocket and removed the unsigned diner receipt she had believed remained inside her cookbook at home. He handed it back to her. The ancient crest still shimmered faintly beneath the morning light, but beneath it appeared a single handwritten sentence that had not been there before. Thank you for reminding me why hope deserves another chance. Claire looked up in surprise. When did you write this? While you were sleeping? No. He smiled very slightly. While you were changing an old kingdom without realizing it. She carefully folded the receipt and placed it inside her purse instead of asking another question. Some answers no longer required explanation. As the sedan quietly departed the estate, Claire looked back through the rear window. Sebastian remained standing beneath the ancient stone entrance, watching the car disappear beyond the open gates. For the first time in centuries, the king did not feel as though he were guarding the past. He was finally looking toward the future, and neither of them realized that the brightest part of the morning had only just begun. Claire Dawson arrived back at the roadside diner just as the morning shift was beginning. The familiar neon sign still buzzed softly above the entrance. Delivery trucks still rumbled along the highway, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted into the cool Pennsylvania air. After everything she had witnessed during the longest night of her life, the ordinary world somehow looked more extraordinary than before. Frank Miller looked up from behind the register with a puzzled expression. You are early, he said. Claire smiled as she hung her apron on the familiar hook. I could not sleep. Big night? He laughed, expecting an ordinary answer. Claire glanced toward the window where sunrise painted golden reflections across the wet pavement. Something like that. She never tried to explain where she had been. Some experiences belonged less to words than to the quiet changes they left behind. The morning passed as countless others had. She poured coffee for exhausted nurses finishing overnight shifts. She joked with construction workers before they headed to new job sites. She packed pancakes for a father taking breakfast home to his children. Nothing about her routine changed, yet everything about the way she saw those ordinary moments had become different. Every conversation seemed a little more meaningful. Every smile lasted a little longer. Around 9 o'clock, Mrs. Hernandez slowly entered the diner carrying a small paper bag. Claire immediately walked around the counter to greet her. You should not have come all this way. The elderly woman smiled warmly. I baked cinnamon rolls for the staff. I thought you might forget to eat after another long night. Claire hugged her gently before helping her into a booth. Looking across the dining room, she suddenly understood exactly what Sebastian had meant. Hope had never hidden inside palaces or ancient ceremonies. It had always lived quietly inside ordinary people who chose kindness when no one expected it. Less than an hour later, the familiar bell above the entrance chimed once again. Claire looked up automatically. Sebastian Vitelli stepped inside wearing the same charcoal overcoat she had first seen beneath the rain several days earlier. No convoy waited outside. No attendants followed him. He looked like nothing more than another traveler stopping for a morning coffee. Claire smiled before he reached the counter. Back again? You make excellent coffee. She poured a fresh cup without asking how he liked it. This time he accepted it immediately instead of letting it grow cold. Neither of them hurried to speak. The comfortable silence between them no longer carried mystery, it carried understanding. Finally, Claire leaned against the counter with an amused expression. So, does every king spend his mornings in roadside diners? Sebastian looked around at the quiet restaurant where strangers greeted one another by name and waitresses remembered favorite breakfast orders without writing them down. Only the wise ones. Claire laughed, shaking her head. I still think you are exaggerating everything that happened. He looked directly at her. No, I simply spent too many years forgetting that the strongest foundations are usually built where nobody is looking. She reached into her apron and placed the old receipt with the ancient crest on the counter between them. Its edges had already begun to soften from being folded and unfolded so many times. I think I will keep this. I hoped you would. To remind me that impossible nights sometimes happen, Sebastian smiled gently. To remind both of us. Outside the diner window, the same yellow morning light that had greeted Claire at the beginning of countless ordinary workdays stretched across the parking lot. This time, however, she was not standing alone beneath it. Sebastian stepped beside her near the entrance as customers came and went without realizing who he truly was. Together they watched the sun rise above the highway, illuminating familiar roads that suddenly seemed filled with endless possibility. No ancient oath remained unfinished. No hidden mystery waited to be solved. The question had been answered. The tradition had remembered its purpose. A kingdom had chosen hope over habit, and a waitress had returned to the life she loved without asking for anything in return. Yet somewhere between the first cup of coffee and the first light of morning, two people from completely different worlds had quietly discovered the same lasting truth. Real greatness is never measured by power. It is measured by the choices made when nobody is watching. And beneath the warm yellow glow that echoed the lonely light where the story had begun, neither of them needed another question, because the answer had already changed everything.